Let me introduce myself. I see some familiar faces here. My name is Heather Perriam. I am a business applications practice lead for a company called Trustmark here in the UK. I am not originally from the UK, if you didn't guess that. I moved here from America, where I started my Power Platform career, and I've been excited to continue it here. Uh, Accessibility is probably my favorite topic. And as somebody who has a disability, has a mobility issue, as well as ADHD, I'm very passionate about making sure that apps are accessible and inclusive to everybody. The presentation today is only about 15 minutes, so I'm just going over the basics, but I promise you, if you have any questions, comments, anything else you would like to know about building accessible apps, feel free to reach out to me. I'll get my contact info at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, um, I want to talk about why accessibility matters. And I've got some points on the slide here. We've got over 1 billion people worldwide that experience some form of disability. That's roughly 15% of the global population. If you're in a room with 100 people, 15 of them probably have some type of disability. But many of our digital solutions are still not designed with accessibility in mind, and that creates significant barriers for users, right? Um, so the importance of accessibility, it's not just about compliance. So we can go through, and I'll talk about some of those tools today that say, yeah, this is compliant, or technically it's accessible, but it's also about being inclusive, right? So if we make our Power Apps accessible and inclusive, we ensure that everyone, regardless of their ability, can use and benefit from our solutions. This includes people with visual, auditory, motor, and cognitive impairments. There's a business and ethical perspective to this too, right? So accessibility, it ensures a better user experience for everyone, not just people with disabilities. That will give you increased engagement, productivity, and usability across diverse user groups. And companies that prioritize accessibility demonstrate social responsibility and inclusivity. There's legal and ethical frameworks. So there's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is WCAG, WCAG. I hear people call it different things. There's the ADA, which is the Americans with Disability Act, and the UK Equality Act that enforce accessibility standards, and obviously many others worldwide. Microsoft has a commitment to accessibility. It's leading the way in accessible technology. So Power Apps include built-in accessibility features such as screen reader support for users who rely on that assistive technology, keyboard navigation for users that can't use a mouse, right? And then contrast and color tools so that you can improve that visual clarity. And then accessibility checkers and app checkers within the Power Platform space that help you identify potential issues within the apps. So when I go through and I'm designing an app, in addition to looking at the accessibility standards that have been lined out or the tools that are built in, I also like to just think about that real world impact. So sometimes I think about users with low vision who rely on high contrast or screen readers in order to be able to navigate through the solution. Maybe somebody with limited motor skills who navigates only using a keyboard or voice commands, right? Which is really fascinating. And then always keeping in mind that if we build it accessible, it doesn't just help users with disabilities, it actually benefits everyone, including aging populations and users in different environments. So by making accessibility a priority in our Power App, it's not just about meeting guidelines, right? It's about empowering every user we have. So by designing with accessibility in mind, we create solutions that are inclusive, equitable, and effective for everyone. So building accessible apps. So we talk about using meaningful labels and headings for clear navigation, right? And so when we're going through, we want somebody to know exactly what they're supposed to be doing at that part of the app. Labels and headings, they provide the structure and the guidance to users, and especially when they're using screen readers and navigating that way. every control, whether it's a button, an input, drop down, they should have clear descriptive labels so that everybody knows what it does. An example is if you have a button on a form, instead of saying like click here, you can use submit form or save changes, and now everybody understands exactly what action will happen when that button is pressed. Proper tab order and keyboard navigation. I think the first time I used an app checker and it said like my tab control wasn't there.
Are there any questions from anyone? We can include them on chat in the meantime.
Hi, Brian.
I was going to ask a question. It might be more relevant for Heather to answer, so it's a shame that she dropped off, but I'll just kind of open it up and see if anyone else has got any thoughts. Heather was talking about around kind of accessible design, always using labels on buttons. Now, in the modern button control that Microsoft have released, you've got the option to use it with icon only, and I've seen this used for things like a home button or an edit icon with a pencil. Is that generally considered bad design from an accessible point of view because there's no label there?
It's a good question. I don't know whether I call it bad design. Ideally, you would always have a label with it. But of course, there are moments where you can't fit a label into the space that you have available. And if you're in that kind of situation, you really want it to be very obvious as to what the icon's going to do. So something like a house signifying home, I think the majority of people using mobile phones would understand that that's what that means. As long as you're not going too far outside the bounds of what someone would intuitively think it is, I think it's okay. But it is, it's a tricky one.
Okay, thank you.
Heather's joining, I think.
Yes, she's back.
I'm back. I'm so sorry. I don't know. I was wired connection and everything, but that was just to make sure everybody's paying attention.
That's okay.
So,
we just talked a bit about accessibility while you're off.
Awesome. Anything interesting?
Yeah.
Yes, there's a question.
Do you want to ask that again, Brian?
Yeah, so I just asked a question around what you were talking about around always using labels for good design from an accessibility point of view. Now, with Microsoft's modern button control, you have the option to make it icon only. I've seen this used for things like a home icon or a pencil as an edit icon. Is that generally considered not great design from an accessibility point of view because there's no label there?
It's interesting. And maybe this was, I don't have a share option, Charles. I don't know why it's not letting me share. I was about to, we're going to just Heatherize this a little bit since you brought that up, because I was going to show today an example of an app that I spun up. Let's just see if this will come. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, so apparently my wire connection is going to be bad, which means I'm going to share from my desktop. So we are going to wing this, just to let you know. But let me go back and share that again. Give me just one moment. Thank you, everybody, for being patient. I guess we should all know that we can have tech issues, right?
Yeah.
So if we look at, this is an app that I built earlier using Copilot, which is one of my favorite accessibility tools, right? Because I can just tell Copilot things and it gives me a good starting point. And I said, hey, Copilot, I want to build an app that stores accessibility information for my employees. And then I went in and it was like, oh my gosh, this goes against all of the accessibility design principles, because we don't have on this application buttons that explain what everything does. We're using icons, right? And so now somebody has to know, like, oh, if I click the pencil, an action is going to happen, or if I click the delete button and the trash can, maybe it'll delete something. But that is against design principles. So Brian, to your point, I think that's a really good example. Is sometimes even if we're doing something that we think, okay, this will definitely make sure it's accessible and definitely make sure that I'm within those guidelines. We have to double check ourselves, because it might not necessarily pick up. I didn't touch this app, right? It didn't add anything to it. I just said, hey, and you can, anybody who's built from Copilot before knows this is exactly what happens, right? It gave me 3 screens when I would probably build it into one, all of that kind of stuff, right? But then one of the tools that's built into Power Apps that we can use to check our accessibility is our app checker. And do you see how it comes up with 31 accessibility errors right off the bat? And so this comes into all of these things that are missing accessible labels. What does that mean? That means if I'm using a screen reader and I go over something, my screen reader isn't able to tell me what it is or what its function is or what it does. And if I'm visually impaired, I might not be able to figure it out, right? And that makes the app less accessible to me. We can find that accessibility label when we go into the properties of the components. And this is really hard to do on one screen. Oh my gosh, I'm spoiled by 2 monitors, you guys. But and we're able to look at it there and add that accessibility label at that time. The other thing, though, that it comes up with is the bit that I talked about, I think, before I got disconnected, which was the tab stop. So these components, these items that are listed out, don't actually have anything built into it to tell the screen reader where to go next and how to navigate through the app, which can be a problem, right? When you're going through it. So I think that was a really good discussion, or question, statement, whatever we want to call it. Really quickly, I'm just going to switch because I'm conscious of time and kind of go back through the rest of what I was going to share, just so I can make sure that we cover it. Just give me just 1 second. So you do want to avoid complex UI elements when you're going through that, right? So if you start putting in, and I know some of you should feel really guilty when I'm about to say this, and I do because I've done it, but like a hidden text label, for example, right? I call it like my dev mode, and maybe I have a text label in there and then I'm hiding it. That can actually cause a problem when people are using screen readers. They still might pick that up. So just keeping that in mind, that everything we do in our final production version, we need to think about how that's accessible to other people. Color and contrast. I'll give you guys some resources at the end of this where you can, different tools that you can use to check that. If you use the Power Apps themes, those should be compliant as far as contrast goes and be accessibility. If you're going to design your own theme, you definitely want to run it through a checker and make sure that that color contrast has the ratio that it's needed in order to be accessible by people. The other bit in here, which I find really interesting, is avoid relying solely on color to convey your meaning. So when I was in school, the teacher would go through and like red pen everything that was wrong. So then I grew up associating the color red with something bad, like a lot of us do. Well, what happens if I can't see the color red? Then I have no indication that there's something else going on. So that's where using icons, pop-up, stuff like that, other visual indicators or other indicators beyond just the color change to say, like, there's an issue here. And also the screen reader will be able to pick that up. If you have a pop-up element and we put the focus on, then the screen reader is going to say, hey, this focused item just came up and said, like, there's an issue with it. Test it. Do that Power Apps app checker. I think that's a really good benefit. Don't sigh when you get 500 accessibility errors. Just go in and fix them so you can make sure that everybody can access their app. Test it with screen readers. I'm going to link you at the end to the NVDA screen reader. That's free. It's a free open source that you can download, and you can use a screen reader to test your application's accessibility. And then just do some manual testing. Try getting around with the keyboard and seeing, are you going to the right place? And the biggest piece that has been so useful to me is using user feedback. And so I always ask people with the applications, especially people who are really willing to give me that feedback, who might have an impairment that says, hey, Heather, I can't actually read that. I know you think it looks good, but I can't see it, or it makes the content less consumable for me. So our key takeaways, aside from thank you for your patience with Heather's technology, is build apps with accessibility in mind from the start. So it's so much easier as we put these components together if we're doing it as we go. And then you don't end up with 260 accessibility errors at the end, right? Use your structured layouts, use accessible controls, and make sure that color contrast is there. And then make sure you regularly test what you're doing. Some resources that I'll share with you in the chat. We have, as I mentioned, the downloadable screen reader. that you can use to put on your screen and see how your app's responding to that. I've got the web content accessibility guidelines, got the web AIM contrast checker, which is a really good tool just to see if your contrast is there. And then I have some additional information on the ADA's guidance on web accessibility, as well as the UK government's accessibility regulations. So thank you so much. I'm not going to keep you from the exciting part where we're going to build beautiful apps. But again, apologize for the technical difficulties. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Reach out to me on LinkedIn, send me a message. And thank you so much for your time. I don't know if there's any questions right now I can answer, but I appreciate you all.
Thanks, Heather. That was fantastic. You fit so much information into such a short time there. It's so good,
it's a lot, isn't it?
Great info. Yeah, I think pretty much everyone who's built Power Apps has had this moment, at least in the early days, when you build an app and then you go to the app checker and you're like, what? How are there 300 accessible labels I haven't filled in? And then you have to go through and fill them all in if you want your app to be accessible. So yeah, that one about doing it from the start is really important. If there are no questions, then we can just jump straight over to JP. But if anyone has questions about Heather's talk, we've got Brian, then yeah, of course you can ask them at the end as well. Brian, go ahead.
I was just going to ask a question about the tooltip. How is that viewed in terms of accessibility? I've heard kind of conflicting views on that. Some people say it's good for accessibility, some people say it's bad for accessibility to make use of tooltips.
I think that's a good question. And I think it goes back to gathering that feedback from your users. So I have a friend of mine who he lost his vision in his 30s. So he's really interesting to talk to when it comes to accessibility, because he went from fully accessible to like, I can't access anything. And because I was getting feedback, I would do like alt text and stuff on my pictures, or the tooltips, Brian, like you mentioned. And I'm really descriptive and I'm afraid of leaving something out, right? So I was like writing all this, and then I'd get yelled at by something that said, oh no, your caption should only be like X number of letters or whatever, and I was like, okay, so maybe I'm doing this all wrong. His feedback to me was that he actually, like, the more you describe something for me, the more I'm able to understand what it is. And so if you try to like brief it up, then I might not get the full essence of what you're doing. But if you've talked to one vision impaired person, that's all you've talked to, right? So other people may have different opinions. And I think it is important to check in with your audience. But I can just say anecdotally, that was the feedback that I got in that. And it also highlighted for me, like, just because something like a tool might tell me one thing, it's really important to listen to your users and your community so that you can understand what makes it accessible for them.